Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigo. A partial shutdown of the government is underway as a midnight Saturday deadline came and went without lawmakers reaching a deal on funding for a border wall. President Trump blaming Democrats for the standoff despite vowing to take the mantle for it just last week. So how long is the shutdown likely to last, and are the two sides any closer to a compromise? Let's ask Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, columnist Kim Strassel, and editorial page writer Kate Batchelder Odell. So, Dan, let's talk about the stakes here, because we've had shutdowns over the holidays before. Remember Gingrich and Clinton in '95, but that was over a huge vision of government. What are the stakes here?
Well, excellent question. I mean, as Friday turned into Saturday last night, 1/4 of the federal government did, in fact, turn into a pumpkin. And when I woke up the next morning, people were still out there doing their Christmas shopping, wrapping Christmas gifts, and getting ready to travel to see their families. So as far as they're concerned, I think life is going on as normal. But down there in Washington, they're fighting, not over the funding of the federal government per se. That's a pretext for the battle between Donald Trump and basically the Democrats, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, over the funding of, now that's the question, are they wanting funding the wall or border security?
Democrats
they want border security. Trump wants the wall. And I've argued before on this program, it's a semantic distinction, and that ultimately there'll come over some agreement, which the Democrats can call border security and the president can call the wall.
Okay, why did the president switch positions? He had agreed, everybody thought, with Mitch McConnell's deal that he would kick the funding 2 months into February, and they postponed this. But then he reversed himself. Why?
Paul, you're right. I mean, McConnell would not have brought that short-term resolution to the floor if he didn't have the support of the president. So he did obviously make a huge late change. I think part of it was a revolt among more conservative members in the House and the Freedom Caucus, basically daring him to shut the government down and saying, as we've heard before, that it will hurt Democrats more, even though that hasn't been our lived experience.
Well, and it's the political symbolism, correct? It's basically Trump campaigned on the wall. He wants to define this as a victory for funding for something he can call a wall.
Sure, but we have not moved past the $1.6 billion line that's been in the Senate bill the entire time. I think it's important to note that even now we've gotten nowhere past that. We had Pence and Mick Mulvaney on Capitol Hill last night trying to negotiate a deal but to avoid the shutdown. But, I mean, one issue here is it's not clear what President Trump is willing to sign. So they are weakened automatically by not really knowing that.
Yeah, and Kim, the president has been asking for $5 billion. If the House passed, a little more than $5 billion. The Senate, 1.6. Some say 1.3. I'm not sure. I've talked to people in government who say they can't even spend $5 billion between now and the end of September when this budget is on a wall. They couldn't even do it.
Yeah, that's one of the problems, and that gets to the symbolism part. But look, I think what you do see is both sides already, and maybe this will go on for a long time, but as everybody sits and talks about this, there's already some discussion about splitting things down the middle coming. You know, I think the White House has been careful to leave itself open to the possibility of a deal, of some meeting in minds. And the Democrats, interestingly, their leaders seem to leave that open as well, too. So I think that could be where we end up with this if we do get a deal.
Kim, is there any political vulnerability here for Democrats on this? Or, I mean, they don't take over Congress until next month.
No, for them, I think this is a freebie. It helps as well that the president said just last week, I'm willing to take responsibility for this. I'll own this shutdown. So he's now reversed himself, and he's saying, well, it's on you, it's on you. But they feel they have that protection there. They're not running the White House. It's not their demands that are supposedly shutting down the government. So they feel pretty confident right now.
But
well, they do need some direction from the White House. I mean, they're sitting over there on Capitol Hill trying to negotiate over a number, whether it's $1.6 billion or $5 billion, whatever the nature of the wall, the security is. But the White House, I mean, the reason Mitch McConnell passed the bill earlier in the week and sent all the senators home is because he thought he had got a clear signal from the White House that they were willing to push it over till February. Then the president changed his mind, and now all these people are coming back. That suggests chaos. The White House at some point has to put something on the table that they can talk around. Otherwise, you're just going to see this wheel spinning indefinitely.
Border security, though, Kate, seems to me that Democrats do not want to be seen to oppose something called border security. That's the major vulnerability here. So I could see us coming out of this with Democrats saying, we voted for border security, X dollars, and Trump saying, no, they voted for a wall, and they both agree to disagree about what they voted for.
Right, Paul. We're seeing this sort of long debate over what's a wall versus what's border security and so on and so forth. But I think the shutdown has made them just not as vulnerable to those attacks in the first place, because it looks like Trump can't govern and is shutting down the government. So I don't think they're as worried about that as perhaps they should be. I'd also add that the time pressure here doesn't appear to be as urgent, because lawmakers are basically going back and forth from home to here and have said they'll have 24 hours to vote in the House before they're called back. So a lot of people have called it quits and assumed that whatever we come up with will have to pass on unanimous consent anyway, and thus not need their vote.
And 70% of the government is already up and running. It's already been financed, and maybe by the time things are deemed essential, it may be only 10% shuts down. But you know what the tragedy here is, I think, politically for the president? Earlier this year, he could have had $23 billion for a wall in return for legalizing the so-called dreamers.
Yeah.
He didn't press that issue, that deal. He could have had it, and he walked away from it. And now he's going to have to settle for a lot less.
And he could be in Washington instead in Mar-a-Lago playing golf for the next 16 days.
Well, Kim, why did they not take that deal?
Look, just bullheadedness in the end. They had disagreements within Republicans over the ranks, and rather than work hard, try to get everybody on the same page, the president just didn't put any real effort into it. He didn't make it a priority. And as we all know, if you don't have the leader of your party fully signing on and pushing people to do something, it's not likely to take place.
And it's going to be even harder to go ahead with Nancy Pelosi taking over the House in early January. Still ahead, Defense Secretary Jim Mattis resigns following President Trump's surprise announcement that he'll pull all U.S. troops from Syria. We'll take a closer look at the global and the political fallout when we come back. Defense Secretary James Mattis announced Thursday that he would resign at the end of February, a day after President Trump made the surprise announcement that he'll withdraw all U.S. forces from Syria, and amid reports that he's planning a drawdown in Afghanistan as well. Both of those moves have been met with opposition from the Pentagon. And in his resignation letter, Secretary Mattis laid out his disagreements with the president, concluding, quote, "Because you have the right to have a Secretary of Defense whose views are better aligned with yours, I believe it is right for me to step down from my position." We're back with Dan Henninger, Kim Strassel, and Kate Batchelder-Odell. So, Kate, you've been reporting on this subject, but it's been building for some time, the disagreements over policy between Secretary Mattis and the president.
That's right, Paul. It has been building out for some time, but a couple notes here on that. I mean, some are arguing basically that Mattis wanted a robust presence in Syria for, forever or for some unknown length of time. But there's been some internal disagreement among, say, John Bolton, National Security Advisor, and Jim Mattis over this. So I think what that should tell you is how outside of the norm and how impulsive President Trump's decision appears to be to withdraw from Syria, because Mattis has had a sort of different view than many on the national security staff about containing Iran and Syria, among many other subjects.
You mean he was more reluctant than, say, John Bolton and Pompeo on that score? That's what I've been thought all along.
Right. No, he was more reluctant to start something in Syria or the Middle East that the U.S. didn't have the political will to sustain.
So this Syria difference is as much about process, in other words, than the ultimate policy. Process in the sense that the president did it so impulsively after a phone call from Erdogan, the president of Turkey, and that General Joe Dunford, for example, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, has let it be known that he wasn't even consulted in advance. It's very hard for a defense secretary to stay in a job if basically your chief deputy, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, wasn't even in on the decision.
Right, it is. And I mean, I think another thing to remember here is that while there has been some tension building between Mattis and others in the administration, Mattis has had an entire military career on executing decisions that he doesn't necessarily agree with.
Right.
So I think over the past week, the situation has really changed.
All right, Dan. So what does this mean? I think this is the biggest change inside the administration in terms of the impact that a lot of people are feeling about how things might go from here on out. What do you think it means for policy going forward?
Well, I think it means that policy will have to be essentially rebooted. Look, you're going to need a new Secretary of Defense who's going to have to come in and deal with the aftermath of the Mattis resignation. And the big issue here, as I was suggesting, it is as much about process as policy. Nobody saw this coming. And some may argue, well, the president makes decisions, and he's a strong decision maker. The problem is in an area like this, you have allies and enemies all around the world who have to make calculations based on an event like this. None of our friends in the Middle East, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or in Europe, or in Asia saw this coming. They have not merely had a decision about withdrawing from Syria. We have now lost a Secretary of Defense who had relationships with all of these people and commitments to them. The new Secretary of Defense is going to have to go around the world explaining to them what happened and why, and whether policy has changed or not. In that time, all of them are going to recalculate their interest. For instance, the Kurds, the Egyptians, whether they should talk to the Russians because the United States isn't going to be there anymore. The Israelis have to make those kinds of calculations. So I think this is going to reverberate well into 2019 and shake up our alliances all over the world.
Kim, all that being said, and I agree with what Dan said, I think that we should, I would say anyway, and I wonder if you agree, that Mattis did this the right way, in the sense that if you really cannot any longer in good conscience implement a president's policies, decisions, you have an obligation to resign, state your reasons, and leave, rather than fight it internally, try to scupper it internally, try to leak to the media in ways that are destructive, or write anonymous op-eds, as we saw somebody do, that criticizes the administration. This is an honorable step.
No, this is the way things are supposed to be done. It's an honorable man. He took absolutely the right decision, even though I think it is a tragedy for the country that he is leaving. And look, Paul, I just think, though, that this has to be put in the broader context of what's going on in the White House, which is what makes it a little bit more disturbing. And that who else are we also having Chief of Staff Kelly? And by all indications, this is because the president is resisting the advice that he is getting from his secretaries and from members of his cabinet. He wants to be less governed, and he'd make impulsive decisions like this in Syria. That's a little bit worrisome, and it does beg the question of who comes in to replace Mattis. Is it someone that's going to be allowed to give sound advice, allowed to execute policy, or is it going to be someone that's more of a token figurehead? And that's a little bit worrisome, especially for that position.
Kate, what names do you hear for possible defense secretaries?
I mean, Paul, we know someone like Jack Keane, the retired Army general, would be in the mix, but who knows at this point? I think Kim's right that who would want to take this job now that they know that the president may or may not be relying on their advice and may be undermining them in public. I mean, that's a tough question. I don't know the answer to that.
All right, thank you all. Still ahead, President Trump's Syria decision drawing fire from lawmakers on both sides. We'll tell you what's at stake in the Middle East as U.S. troops come home.
The only reason they're not dancing in the aisles in Tehran and ISIS camps is they just don't believe in dancing. This is a big gift to them, and this is a devastating decision for our allies.
The surprise decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria coming via tweet on Wednesday, with President Trump declaring, quote, "We've defeated ISIS in Syria, my only reason for being there," during the Trump presidency. The move startling allies and drawing widespread criticism on Capitol Hill, with lawmakers warning of the dire consequences in the Middle East.
It is clear to me that if you withdraw now, based on the conditions on the ground, Iran is a big winner inside of Syria. A corridor between Tehran to Lebanon will exist to funnel weapons to Hezbollah and other forces aligned against Israel. And most importantly, none of us believe that ISIS has been defeated.
Jonathan Schanzer is Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Good to see you again. Thanks for being here. So what's your take on this Syria decision?
Well, I think Lindsey Graham's right, but I think he maybe even has understated the problems that we may see in the future here. Undoubtedly, Iran is set to cash in on this decision. It is probably the most pleased out of all of America's enemies and adversaries who watch this decision unfold. They will be able to establish that land bridge from western Iran to the Mediterranean, supporting Hezbollah, the Shiite militias, and, of course, the Assad regime itself. Don't forget also that we're now leaving the Russians unchallenged in Syria. They're going to have supremacy in the skies. They will be able to do as they please in Syria without so much as a challenge from the United States. On top of that, one of the things that I think a lot of people have ignored here is that the Kurds are going to be left out to dry. The Turks right now are preparing for an onslaught. It's likely that we're going to see a massive battle in northern Syria. The Turks have indicated as much. So you think about it right now, the Israelis are nervous. Probably the Jordanians are nervous. The Kurds are nervous. There really isn't one ally of the United States that's pleased with this, and certainly all of our enemies are very pleased.
But let me push back on that in this sense. I think the president says, look, you leave troops there. What's our national interest? And what's your plan? We just have endless war. Is that it? And we're going to be fighting everybody else's fights. He says, isn't it time for other people to fight their own fights? That's his argument. I'm not saying I agree with it, but that's his argument. What's your response?
Look, I get that, but I would say that the U.S. isn't exactly fighting anyone else's battles right now with 2,000 troops in Syria. What we've done is we've established a beachhead there to let everyone know that we're not going anywhere, and then it's been a deterrent. We're not deploying tens of thousands of troops. We're not putting our men and women in harm's way on a regular basis over there. It's a statement that we're not ready to give up on Syria. That's what we've been doing there. I think we've drawn down, and I think we should be proud of the fact that we've got a minimal presence. We've contained a virus, is the way that I would put it. I don't think ISIS is defeated, but I do think it's been contained, and we had the ability to continue to contain it at minimal cost. And now the president is withdrawing our last line of defense, and in the process, likely thrusting the entire region into chaos.
Well, why wouldn't this be seen as, by some people, I know the American people, is we're just nation building again in Syria. And we're going to end up being there, and we're going to have to occupy that territory for a long time, and that's going to cost a lot of money. Is this nation building if we stayed there?
No. Again, you know, we're looking at 2,000 troops. I don't think there's really much of an emphasis at all on nation building. In fact, I believe the United States has already declared that we would not take part in nation building so long as Iran was part of the process, and Iran is certainly still part of the process there. So again, minimal outlay. But again, the idea here was to deter our enemies. And I think that we had done that with a minimal presence, a smaller footprint. And I think that really through that smaller footprint, we were proving Trump right. I mean, Trump had made his point that we don't need to send massive numbers of troops. We don't need a major outlay in the Middle East in order to maintain control. And now in one fell swoop, he's just said, you know what, never mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that concerns me the most is the Kurds, because and some of the Arabs who are part of the Syrian Democratic Forces, because they were our agents on the ground, have been, to go after ISIS. In other words, they were taking the casualties on the ground. We could we could help them with aerial cover, with intelligence, with other things that we can do, but without putting our own people in the front lines. But they're taking these casualties, and now we're walking out, and they're going to say, hey, why did we do that? It's going to be very tough to get them to help us again.
That's right. I think the Kurds do feel as if they've been thrown under the bus here, and certainly we'll have to wait and see what Erdogan does, the president of Turkey. If he decides to turn up the heat on the Kurds in northern Syria, we could see a massive battle, and then there is the broader question of whether the United States intervenes or tries to halt that violence. No one knows exactly what's going to happen here. But I think it's also important to note that if you're a U.S. ally right now and you're looking at this decision made by the president, you're wondering kind of whether the president is interested in sticking it out in other key places, like South Korea, like Afghanistan, like Iraq, even where we've got smaller footprints. There's a question now of whether this president, whether the United States, whether this Pentagon is willing to stick it out with some of its most enduring allies. I think that is really the upshot here, and I think there are a lot of nervous friends of the United States looking around right now.
And I guess if you combine that with the the report that the president may draw down half of the forces in Afghanistan, that anxiety will grow even more. Jonathan Schanzer, thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Despite signs of an economic slowdown and anxiety in financial markets, the Federal Reserve raises interest rates for the fourth time this year. So did the central bank make a mistake? And what can we expect in 2019? Despite signs of a slowdown in the economy and anxiety in financial markets, the Federal Reserve Wednesday raised interest rates by a quarter point and signaled 2 more increases in 2019. The move comes amid ongoing criticism of the central bank from President Trump. But Fed Chair Jay Powell said political considerations play no role in his decision-making.
Political considerations play no role whatsoever in our discussions or decisions about monetary policy. We have the independence, which we think is essential to be able to do our jobs in a non-political way. And, we at the Fed are absolutely committed to that mission, and nothing will deter us from doing what we think is the right thing to do.
Douglas Holtz-Eakin is the former director of the Congressional Budget Office and president of the American Action Forum. Doug, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Markets really didn't like, at least as I see it, the Federal Reserve's decision. You could watch the equities fall almost as Chairman Powell was speaking. They were falling. And then the bond markets yields have also fallen in some of the mid to long end. Did the Fed make a mistake?
I don't think so. If they made a mistake, it was over a year ago when they held rates too low too long, and we did see equity markets and other asset markets get inflated a little bit. As they've normalized, that froth has come out, and I think that's been the bulk of what's gone on. The real issue is going to be in 2019. There are some signs of weakness in the economy. Certainly housing's weak. Financial markets do indicate tighter conditions. So the tough decisions are ahead, but it wasn't yesterday. Yesterday was good.
All right, but the Fed's doing 2 things, right? It's raising at the same time. It's raising interest rates, okay, and then it's also withdrawing its bond buying. So you're getting 2 kinds of tightening. And now we've never done this before. The Fed hasn't, at least not in my lifetime, and I can't remember. So it's something of an experiment. Isn't that an argument for caution and going slow?
I think it's a great observation. It's one that I think has been too little commented on. We have never done this before, and it's hard to translate the sort of rundown in the portfolio into the equivalent of interest rate increases, but it's there. And we do see financial conditions tightening. There's no question about that. So I think caution is the right word. But I think that if you've got essentially a 0 real federal funds rate, that's not consistent with the kind of growth we have in the real economy, which is close to 3% right now. So the hike this week was not a mistake. The real issue is what happens going forward.
Okay, so how strong is the economy now? I mean, we're getting conflicting signals. Certainly financial markets are, as you say, showing some tension, some cracking. Housing, not so good. Interest rate sensitive. Auto sales, not so good. But how is the rest of the economy?
I think it's fair to expect the economy to slow somewhat, but the question is to what? And we know the old normal was something a little under 2%, and the whole goal was to have a set of policies that move that north to, say, 2.5% or even 3%.
3, yeah. I was hoping for 3 for a while, Doug.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see 3, but that largely has to do with the trade front. So I expect it to soften, but I think all that chatter about recession is wildly out of bounds. You can't have a recession in the U.S. without having the household sector really go south. That's 70% of spending, and that's contributing 2% of GDP growth every quarter now, and it's quite solid. The income growth solid. The unemployment rate's under 4%. So I think the chatter about recession is just really too much.
All right. Well, what about investment, capital investment? Because that was one of the big arguments that I know I made and other people made about, I think you did too.
And I made.
about an argument for tax reform that had been so slow during the Obama era of expansion, post-crisis. And we thought there was a lot of room to move that up with deregulation and tax reform. Is that working?
It has moved up. People forget that. If you look at year-over-year increases, they are faster now than they were in 2016, 15, 14. If you look at comparisons to projections made before the tax reform, we're above those projections. I think the disappointment has been after a very strong first half of 2018, we got a really weak third quarter, and people are worried about the fourth quarter. The CEO confidence is down. We get bad monthly data on orders, and that suggests that while the tax reform did its job, the rest of the policy portfolio has not done its job. And I would largely point the finger at trade tensions, which have caused a lot of companies to back off their CapEx plans.
Yeah, that's interesting. The Atlanta Federal Reserve, though, is still saying, I think, 3% growth in the fourth quarter, which would make for the year the first over 3% year since 2005, which we're all glad to see. But the trade tensions is how you would, more than the Fed, is how you would, what you would pinpoint for some of the lack of the slowdown in capital investment and CEO uncertainty?
That's what we see in the survey data. You never know exactly why companies do exactly what they do, but if you look at the survey data, the scaling back comes simultaneously with concerns over especially the relations with China, the threat for auto tariffs with Europe. I think that's the primary culprit. You know, the Federal Reserve is getting back to neutral. It's not tightening. It's getting back faster because of the bond runoff than it might appear to be, but I think it's hard to blame the Fed for raising rates to zero in real terms in an economy that's growing at 3%. That's not a policy mistake.
So if you got a trade deal with China, you think there would be a big positive effect on that in the markets and the economy?
I think the business community would have a big exhale. When the two largest economies on the globe are at loggerheads, no one is comfortable making a decision. And to have that put in the rearview mirror would, I think, really be a great thing for the economy. I understand the president's point that you want to put in the rearview mirror on the right terms. No one thought China was behaving right. Can you get them to behave better in the future? So it's a tough thing to negotiate, but getting it in the past would be a good thing for the outlook.
All right, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, thank you for being here. When we come back, a federal judge postpones the sentencing of President Trump's former national security advisor. What the Flynn fiasco reveals about the methods of Special Counsel Mueller. In a surprise move, a federal judge this week postponed until next year the sentencing of former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Flynn pleaded guilty to a single count of lying to the FBI over his contacts with Russia. Yet U.S. District Judge Emmett Sullivan unloaded on the defendant Tuesday over his supposed violation of FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, a crime Flynn has not been charged with. We're back with Dan Henninger, Kim Strassel, and Jason Riley. So, Kim, what do you make of the judge's unloading on Flynn, and what are your other big takeaways from the sentencing?
Yeah, so the judge had absolutely no business going there because, as you just mentioned, the general was never charged with FARA. He has never admitted to breaking FARA. And beyond that, the judge even got all of his facts incorrect, suggesting that Flynn had actually been lobbying for other countries while he was National Security Advisor. It took the Special Counsel Mueller's team to actually walk back the judge on some of the facts. So inappropriate at every level. But it was useful, Paul, in that it brought some new attention to FARA and why we're even in the court having this discussion. And it's because, you know, the special counsel has been using statutes like this to pressure the targets of his probe into pleading to yet other crimes which they might not even have committed.
Well, when it comes to, I mean, we know Flynn did represent Turkey. Two of his former business partners have been indicted for violating FARA. And basically what the FARA says is you can represent a foreign government, but then you have to register as a foreign agent. And the accusation is that he didn't register, so that the suspicion is that, in fact, Flynn was worried that he might have been indicted by that, and that's why he pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI in this one count, even if he may not have lied to the FBI in truth.
Correct. And look, he should have registered. But the reality is, Paul, that for decades now, the Department of Justice has not really enforced FARA. You normally get a warning letter. So the fact that the special counsel has, you know, taken out this musty law and is using it to get people to plead other things, and that was one of the big drama moments in the court, is there had been pretty good evidence released over the last week that Flynn was treated poorly by the FBI. He wasn't urged to have counsel with him. He wasn't warned about lying. He wasn't told that he was necessarily under investigation. And some thought that he might revoke his plea. He didn't. And so the judge really had no point but to go forward with on the presumption that he was guilty in that regard.
Jason, what do you think about the FBI's handling of General Flynn?
Well, I think there's a lot to be disturbed about, starting with why the Obama administration was investigating Flynn while he was working on the Trump campaign. But Flynn was fired by Trump for lying to the vice president. He then pled guilty, as you just mentioned, to lying to the FBI. That's a crime. You lie to the FBI, I lie to the FBI. There are consequences. There can't be a double standard for Michael Flynn.
Dan?
Well, yes, but on the other hand, it is such a strange incident. The crime he committed was lying to the FBI about his conversations with Russian Ambassador Kislyak, which were not illegal.
The conversations were not illegal.
So, yeah.
They're part of his job, actually.
That was not a crime, but lying to the FBI about illegal activity was a crime, which doesn't really quite compute why a person would do that. As Kim was suggesting, Mueller's investigation was holding over his head a violation of the Foreign Agent Registration Act, and a couple of days before this court hearing, they indicted two of his associates. Looming in the background was the possibility that his son would also be indicted. My reading was that despite Judge Sullivan's repeated questions about, do you really want to plead guilty to this, Mike Flynn was saying, I am pleading guilty so I can avoid jail time, so I will not be bankrupted by this investigation, and I'm trying to get this behind me.
I think Dan is absolutely right. None of these activities were illegal, but lying to the FBI is illegal. I'd also add that this is not the smoking gun that the left thinks it is in terms of proving Russian collusion, because, again, his activities were perfectly legal. The point here is that you can't lie to federal investigators when they come asking questions about that. And Jim Comey, the FBI director at the time, says that he sent these agents over to talk to Flynn because they wanted to find out why he was lying to the vice president about his activities, and that they knew he was lying because he had been under surveillance.
Well, and we know that Comey admitted he wouldn't have gotten away with sending agents over there without a lawyer, without going through the White House General Counsel's office and any other administration. But they tried to get a fast one through here because they told Flynn, oh, you don't need a lawyer. And they never told him he was really the guy under investigation, Kim.
Yeah, it looks like a setup. And also, if you go through the transcript, the notes of that interview by the two agents, it's really actually kind of hard to make the case that he just bald-faced lied. In fact, what he said was, look, I've been talking to, representatives from 30 countries, endless numbers of phone calls. So you're asking me about this one. I don't entirely remember. I don't think I did that. No, I don't think so. But, it wasn't sort of as if it's hard to come away from that and believe that it was a bald-faced lie. Again, also, too, because he had no incentive to do that, right. And because he probably knew he was under surveillance and, in fact, suggests as much that he knew they had a transcript.
All right. Thanks to you all. Still ahead, President Trump's School Safety Commission recommends doing away with Obama-era guidance on discipline, igniting a firestorm among civil rights groups. We'll have the details when we come back. The White House this week released its long-awaited school safety report, recommending, among other things, that the Department of Education scrap Obama-era guidance aimed at reducing racial disparities in school discipline. Those guidelines, handed down in 2014, focused on how to identify, avoid, and remedy what the Obama administration called discriminatory discipline and promoted alternatives to suspension and expulsion. But Education Secretary Betsy DeVos says those policies made schools reluctant to address unruly students or violent incidents. DeVos chaired President Trump's School Safety Commission, which was formed after the February shooting at Parkland High School in Florida. We're back with Dan Henniger, Jason Riley, and Kate Batchelder Odell. So, Jason, right decision?
Oh, long overdue, Paul. It's very difficult for kids to learn in a school that is in chaos, and that is what these Obama guidelines had done. Schools were fearing that the federal government would slap them with a civil rights lawsuit. They feared the expense of it. They feared the reputational cost of it if they didn't stop suspending more black kids. And so that is what schools did. The administration wanted more racial parity in who was getting suspended.
But isn't it true that aren't you supposed to, under this discrimination law, laws actually show discrimination.
Yes, but the administration was using something called disparate impact, which means if statistically you are expelling or suspending more groups in one certain racial or ethnic group or another, that is ipso facto evidence of racial animus that's going on. And that's the fault in the reasoning. Different groups behave in different ways. We see it inside school, outside of school. So blacks are suspended at higher rates than whites. Whites are suspended at higher rates than Asians. It doesn't matter. It doesn't necessarily mean that these groups are being discriminated against. And I'd add very quickly, Paul, in many of these big inner city schools, the teachers are black. The principals are black. The school administrators are black. What incentive do they have to be picking on black kids, if not for the behavior that is going on?
Dan?
Bear in mind, this was not just a policy announcement by the Obama administration. They conducted 350 investigations of school systems on this basis, including most of the large urban school systems in the United States. This is an extraordinary intrusion of the federal government into what typically normally has been a local responsibility. But they were using the threat of withdrawing federal funding to say, you comply with these disparate impact guidelines or we're going to investigate you and threaten you with defunding.
And I guess, Kate, what they use this guidance letter, right? That is something that was a specialty inside the Obama administration, where they said, well, it's not a formal rule, but we're guidance. But it's sort of an order. Yeah, it's an order you can't refuse.
Right, exactly. They said it's just a dear colleague letter. It's just a best practices, which is not really true from what Dan said about conducting roving investigations, etc. But that's why I think, Paul, that even if you disagree with the underlying policy or agree with it, you should support the education department here, because they're getting something off the books here that wasn't a regulation, it wasn't outlined in statute, and it was basically just roving authority to enforce guidelines that they wanted to enforce. So they basically just accomplished something through a guidance letter that should have been debated in a political process.
But I guess the other argument is, Jason, well, people say, well, you formed this commission in relation to Parkland, this terrible shooting incident in a high school, and there's nothing but guns in here. So why isn't this about Parkland about guns?
Well, there is something about guns in there, in the sense that the administration thinks that different states and different localities and different school systems should have different views about guns, whether teachers should be trained to use them, whether they shouldn't be trained, and so forth, and that this should not be a one-size-fits-all type of solution when it comes to recommending safety regulations on the gun front. And I think that is correct, because attitudes about guns do vary. It's a big country, and if you're out west or down south, it's going to be different than whether you're in Manhattan, for instance, when it comes to guns. So I think that is the right step to take.
And what happens now, Dan? I guess this will be challenged in court, like everything else, and we'll see if it can survive.
Well, it's a recommendation so far, and if they wanted to make it more permanent, they would put in a comment period in which they actually were heading towards a regulation or a guideline stronger than simply a recommendation. And it remains to be seen whether the Education Department will do that.
What do you hear, Kate? Are they going to promulgate a formal rule, or are they just going to withdraw that guidance and leave it at that?
I think there's really a strong incentive for them to promulgate a rule and go through the process that the Obama administration avoided. So I think that's what they do, and I think that's what they really should do.
All right, we have to take one more break. When we come back, hits and misses of the week. Time now for hits and misses of the week. Kim, first to you.
Paul, it's a hit for Speaker Paul Ryan, who gave his farewell address to Congress this week. This ends 20 years of service in the House, where he consistently, and I would note always cheerfully, pushed his party into more consistently principled positions on poverty programs, entitlement, taxes. In 2015, he took on a speakership job he did not want, but because he was the only guy who could unite a bitterly divided Republican Party, he managed to get through his career ambition of tax reform. This has been a life of honor and service, and we wish him well in his next chapter.
All right, Jason.
This is a hit for the Weekly Standard magazine, Paul, which this month published its final issue. For more than 2 decades, it was a reliable source of smart, intelligent, conservative commentary on the arts and politics and culture from great writers like Steve Hayes and Fred Barnes and Andrew Ferguson. Weekly reminder that there is intelligent commentary from the right as an alternative to the mainstream media, and I'm one reader who will miss it greatly.
All right, thank you, Jason. Kate.
Paul, one group of people who appear to be taking no time off for the holidays are regulators in the state of California. The Utilities Commission recently proposed a tax on text messages to pay for more phone services for low-income individuals. But my hit, Paul, is for the Federal Communications Commissions for quickly clarifying that this is not appropriate under current law.
Okay. And Dan?
Well, I'm going to give a hit to a real hit, and that is to the great seasonal Christmas song, Baby It's Cold Outside. I mean, this song just came under attack from some corner of the @MeToo movement. Presumably, it's about date rape. In the wake of that, it has risen to number 10 on Billboard's digital top 10 list. Paul, if this is the new standard of political correctness, half of the movies from the 1950s on Turner Classic Movies will have to be banned, and you'll probably have to empty out the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Oh, empty out? You abolish it.
Blow it up. Personally, I intend to spend from now to New Year's listening to perhaps the best version of Baby It's Cold Outside by Rod Stewart and Dolly Parton. Don't miss it.
I won't. Let's make it number 1 on the Billboard charts. All right, and remember, if you have your own hit or miss, be sure to tweet it to us at JER on FNC. That's it for this week's show. Thanks to my panel. Thanks to all of you for watching. I'm Paul Gigot. Merry Christmas. Hope to see you right here next week.